I swear I heard them, voices rising from the sealed graves, begging us not to leave them behind.
Have you ever wondered what you would do if, on a seemingly ordinary night, the absolute silence of a cemetery were shattered by a sound that shouldn't exist, a sound that echoes as if coming from the very womb of the earth, carrying with it the weight of centuries of oblivion? That was the question that hammered at my mind. That night, I stood alone among ancient tombs, flanked only by darkness and a cold wind that seemed to want to drive me away. A gravedigger's job, though many believe it to be merely routine, is made up of constant encounters with death, of steps taken among memories of others who have passed, and of silences so dense they seem to suffocate even the most hardened soul. But that night, the silence wasn't just broken. It transformed into something alive, distressing, something that seemed to want to call me by name. As I walked slowly among the moss-covered tombstones, the flickering light of the lantern barely illuminating the uneven stone floor, I noticed a muffled, almost imperceptible sound, which at first I thought was simply the wind whistling through the cracks of the ancient buildings. But it only took a few seconds for my certainty to fade, giving way to a sensation that still gives me chills just remembering it. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't an animal. It was something different, something pulsating to the rhythm of human voices, voices so distant yet so close that they seemed to emerge from the very heart of the earth. It was at that moment that I realized I was facing something that no logical explanation could justify. And although part of me wanted to run away, another part clung to the ground. Because, as disturbing as it was, I needed to understand where those wails were coming from. And that's precisely where the story of the tomb that everyone would rather forget begins. If you enjoy dark stories like this, subscribe to the channel and leave a like to support future stories. That same night, as I stood motionless amidst the disturbing sound that seemed to emerge from within the earth, I remembered something I'd always heard whispered among the town's elders, stories that had crossed generations like veiled warnings, stories about a family buried together in a remote, forgotten crypt in the oldest section of the cemetery. They said that in the late 19th century, when an epidemic swept through small communities in the region, taking dozens of lives in a matter of days, this entire family was struck down by the disease so suddenly that there was no time for rites, farewells, or proper funerals. The bodies were hastily gathered and sealed in a single tomb, a desperate attempt to prevent the contagion from spreading further. And since then, that space has carried a weight that not even time has been able to erase. The crypt, built of solid stone and closed with rusty chains that no one dared touch, stood abandoned at the edge of the cemetery, where even the bravest visitors avoided trespassing. It was said that even decades after the tragedy, a heavy atmosphere could still be felt there, as if the earth had held within itself not only mortal remains, but also the pain, fear, and despair of those who were thrown there without the chance of a final goodbye. I knew this story, as did everyone who worked at the cemetery, but as with any often repeated legend, it seemed to have lost its impact over the years, becoming just another among many dark narratives associated with the place. But that night, as I heard the laments echoing through the invisible cracks of darkness, I realized that perhaps those ancient stories weren't just legends, but fragments of a truth hidden beneath layers of silence. Most disturbing was the thought that, if the family's tragedy had truly left such profound scars, perhaps the sounds I heard weren't just memories of the past, but living echoes of a suffering that never found rest. And it was this thought that pushed me against all logic to continue, walking toward the forgotten crypt, even knowing that each step brought me closer to something that could forever change the way I viewed the dead and the cemetery itself. As I advanced through the oldest section of the cemetery, the weight of the silence seemed to transform into something almost palpable, as if the air had acquired a different density, thick and suffocating, making each breath weigh heavy in my lungs. At that moment I struggled to convince myself that it was all just an auditory illusion, the result of the wind passing through cracks in the ancient stones. But as my footsteps echoed on the damp ground, the muffled sound returned, more insistent, clearer, as if to ensure I didn't mistake it for anything natural. What had previously seemed like a distant murmur now revealed itself as drawn-out moans, laden with a sadness so profound it was impossible not to feel a shiver run down my spine. Suddenly, amidst those disjointed sounds, a childlike tone emerged. Fragile and pleading, like the voice of a child calling for its parents in the darkness. For a moment, my mind refused to accept that perception. But soon after, another voice joined the first, deeper, hoarser, and the two began to alternate, as if conversing in a desperate plea from beneath the earth. I tried to search for any logical explanation, perhaps a group of young people who had invaded the cemetery to make prank calls, or even someone lost, but I soon realized there were no footsteps, no movement of living bodies around me, only that mournful symphony of laments that seemed to emanate from the bowels of the ground itself. Fear began to grip me almost paralyzingly, but at the same time, a strange curiosity drew me closer, as if the crypt itself wanted to draw me in. With every meter I advanced, the sounds gained substance, making it clear that it was not a single presence but several, intertwined in a chorus of agony that defied any rational explanation. I felt I was not merely hearing echoes, but rather experiencing the echo of a collective suffering that spanned time and manifested itself before me that night. And it was exactly at that point that I understood that there was no turning back, because if I was already hearing such clear voices in the distance, I needed to see what would happen when I was in front of the sealed tomb that held that forgotten family, even though part of me begged not to take another step towards the heart of that darkness. My footsteps grew heavier as I approached the place where the old crypt lay forgotten, and every movement seemed to echo, as if the cemetery itself wished to announce my presence. The path to it was covered with roots that had infiltrated the soil over the decades, and each obstacle reminded me that I was trespassing on a space where time had stood still, as if the earth had frozen the suffering of those buried there. The lantern I carried trembled in my hands, and its flickering light cast distorted shadows on the stone walls, shadows that seemed to take on a life of their own, as if seeking to surround me and prevent me from moving forward. The closer I got, the more intense the wails became, which now mingled with indistinct pleas, repeated at irregular intervals, as if each voice vying for space to be heard, and this mixture created a harrowing cacophony that threatened to shatter my sanity. When I finally glimpsed the structure before me, I realized the crypt was even more imposing than I remembered. Its walls were covered in moss, the inscriptions carved into the stone were nearly erased by time, and the chains that sealed it, though corroded by rust, still stood like silent guardians of a buried secret. I felt a shiver run through my body as I shone a light into the cracks between the stones. The sound of the wailing seemed to intensify, as if those muffled voices knew I was there, listening, and wanted to make themselves understood. With each passing second, the sound ceased to be merely an indistinct noise and grew closer and closer to a human articulation, filled with desperation, as if begging for someone to finally release this torment. There was a moment when I considered retreating, abandoning that section of the cemetery and never returning, but something inexplicable, perhaps a mixture of compassion and morbidity, prevented me from retreating. It was as if the place itself had clung to me, trapping me in an invisible web from which there was no escape. And it was in that moment, faced with the silently menacing crypt and the voices intertwining in a suffocating chorus, that I realized I was about to witness something that transcended any boundary between reason and the impossible. Something that would not only change the way I viewed death, but also reveal a secret that should never have been exposed. Standing before the crypt, I felt as if time had stopped, and even the wind that had previously whistled through the trees seemed to have ceased, giving way to a heavy silence that pressed against my chest. It was at that moment that the wails became so clear that there was no longer any doubt. These were not illusions or tricks of the night, but rather distinct voices intertwining in a chorus of collective despair. First, I heard the childish cry again, fragile and repetitive, as if a child begging for help in a space where the air no longer existed. Immediately afterward, a female voice emerged, filled with pain and supplication, calling out to someone who would never answer, while a male voice, hoarse and deep, echoed like muffled screams, betraying an anguish so dense it seemed to penetrate the solid stone and reach directly into my mind. As I approached the sealed door, I felt a barely perceptible vibration beneath my feet, as if the ground surrounding the crypt pulsed with the same cadence as the wails. This detail made my body shudder so much that for a moment I feared losing my balance. It was as if those voices were not merely trapped underground, but alive, trying to escape, as if each plea was accompanied by an invisible force pressing against the tomb's walls. At that moment, I had the strange sensation that something was watching me, not with physical eyes, but with a presence that haunted my thoughts, invading my innermost being and making any attempt to maintain my reasoning intact impossible. The psychological pressure intensified to such an extent that I began to struggle to breathe, as if the air had become thin and each breath a superhuman effort. The sound of voices no longer seemed to come only from the front of the crypt, but from all sides, surrounding me, enveloping me in a suffocating spiral of pain and agony. I felt my hands tremble more than ever, and the flashlight nearly slipped from my fingers, projecting flickering lights that brought to life distorted shadows on the walls, as if invisible figures silently surrounded me. It was then that I understood the true magnitude of that moment. They weren't just echoes of the past. They weren't memories locked in stone, but souls crying out, voices that never found rest, a collective suffering that remained as vivid as the moment they were sealed within. The weight of that revelation crushed me, and I realized I would never leave that place the same person. Because hearing those laments, it was as if I had become witness to a secret that death itself had tried to bury. Suddenly, as abruptly as it had begun, all sound ceased, and the silence that filled the cemetery was even more terrifying than the wails I had heard up until that moment. The absence of voices was so suffocating that I felt exposed, as if the darkness around me was observing me in absolute silence, awaiting my reaction. I remained motionless for what seemed like endless seconds, trying to understand if what I had witnessed was real or merely the product of a mind weary and haunted by the stories surrounding that place. However, deep down, I knew that nothing I had heard could be explained by reason, and this certainty was what disturbed me most. I retraced my steps slowly, avoiding looking back, as if afraid that if I faced the crypt again, I might hear the voices again, or, worse yet, see something that should never be seen. I never returned to that section, and every time I recall that experience, I feel the same weight in my chest, as if the echoes of that family still accompany me, begging not to be forgotten. Perhaps this is the fate of some dead, to find no rest and to continue crying out for justice, even if their pleas are heard only by those willing to walk among tombs in nights that seem endless. It was a night when the rain seemed endless, and each drop that fell on the tombstones echoed like a mournful drum, marking the rhythm of an unsettling silence. I walked among sodden graves, trying to hold my flashlight steady despite the wind that seemed to want to extinguish it at every turn, when suddenly I realized that something in the atmosphere had changed. It wasn't just the roar of the storm, not just the distant sound of thunder tearing through the dark sky. There was something more, something seeping through the cracks of the night like an ancient whisper laden with a weight that didn't belong in this world. At first, I thought it was just the wind shuffling through the cracks in the rocks, creating sonic illusions that deceived my weary ears. But I soon realized it wasn't the wind, for the words possessed cadence, rhythm, and intention. They were moans interspersed with Latin phrases, intoned like broken prayers that should never be heard at that moment. I felt my body shiver, for these weren't indistinct murmurs but clear voices coming from some specific point, voices that, even muffled by the earth and the wood of an ancient coffin, carried a power capable of transcending time and reaching me full force. With each step I took, the feeling that I was approaching something forbidden grew, as if the cemetery itself wanted to warn me not to go any further. Yet even as fear paralyzed me, curiosity pushed me forward, as if I had been chosen to hear what no one else was meant to hear. And it was in that instant that I understood that the voices were coming from an ancient, isolated tomb, a tomb that held not just a body, but a story capable of freezing the blood of anyone who dared approach. If you enjoyed dark stories like this, subscribe to the channel and leave a like to support future stories. That tomb wasn't like the others surrounding the cemetery, and I'd known that since I started working there. Old-timers always commented that in that grave rested a priest whose story was intertwined with legends no one dared to confirm out loud. They said that in the 19th century he had become known throughout the region for accepting tasks that other priests feared, dedicating himself to confronting what many preferred to deny, exorcism rituals in small towns across the United States, where desperate families turned to faith as a last resort against forces they didn't understand. His reputation grew so much that his name was spoken with respect and awe, as if he were a man chosen to wage invisible battles against evil. However, the story circulating about his death was even more disturbing than the cases that made him famous. It was said that during one of these rituals, facing an entity whose strength surpassed any other confrontation he had ever had, the priest was defeated mid-ceremony, falling to the ground before the stunned faithful, unable to complete the prayer that could free the victim. His body, overcome by exhaustion and the impact of what he had witnessed, never rose again, and the community, gripped by terror, tried to bury him as quickly as possible without the honors due a servant of the church. Some believed this haste was motivated by fear that the entity had taken over not only the ritual, but also his body, making even proximity to his remains dangerous. Ever since, that tomb became a point of unrest, and for generations the story went around that the priest had never found rest, having been defeated by what he fought. And on that stormy night, hearing those Latin voices echoing from underground, I realized that perhaps the legend was not just popular superstition, but rather proof that something within him remained alive, crying out amidst the sodden earth, and that every word was a warning that the true terror was yet to come. As I stood before that ancient tomb, trying to understand if what I had heard was real or merely an illusion created by the storm, I realized the sounds had returned, this time clearer and more unmistakable. They weren't just scattered moans or diffuse echoes caused by the wind, but precisely articulated syllables, forming words that carried a ritualistic force. It was Latin, and even without understanding all the meanings, I could recognize the distinctive rhythm of the prayers, as if someone had been praying inside that sealed coffin for over a century. The sensation of hearing human voices emerging from the earth was so disconcerting that for a few seconds I lost track of the space around me, feeling as if the world had shrunk to that suffocating, insistent sound. My first instinct was to seek rational explanations, even though they seemed absurd. Perhaps it was the wind rushing through the cracks in the rocks. Perhaps some trapped animal was making noises that my weary mind interpreted as voices. Or perhaps the rain and thunder were creating acoustic illusions. However, the more I tried to convince myself of these possibilities, the clearer the words became, until there was no doubt that I was facing something impossible to explain by logic alone. The moans grew in intensity, and among them emerged fragments of fragmented prayers, as if desperate attempts to resume an exorcism long interrupted. With each repetition of the phrases, the psychological weight grew heavier, and I felt my body tremble from the inside out, as if the words had passed through my ears and lodged directly in my mind. It was as if they weren't just sounds, but forces carrying within them a remnant of the struggle waged in that distant past, and this remnant was spilling over into me. The flashlight in my hand trembled involuntarily, and for a moment the light wavered, casting shadows that seemed to move in sync with the wails, as if invisible figures had gathered around me to witness what was about to happen. It was then that I realized there was no point in resisting the call any longer. What I heard was not the echo of an ancient story, but the present manifestation of a torment that had not yet ceased. And although every fiber of my being screamed for me to flee that place, the feeling of being on the brink of a forbidden secret pushed me closer to the grave, paving the way for an encounter I will never forget. As I decided to advance toward the grave, I felt as if my feet were being pulled by an invisible weight, not just by the mud that had formed from the rain, but by a force that seemed to emanate directly from the grave, inviting and repelling me at the same time. Each step was accompanied by a shiver that ran down my spine, and the flashlight I held was barely keeping the darkness at bay, as if the night had grown denser around that part of the cemetery. The sound of prayers continued, interspersed with moans that seemed to rip through the silence in waves, and with each repetition I felt the voices grow closer, as if they were not confined to the coffin's interior, but spreading through the electrically charged air. When I finally got close enough to clearly make out the tomb's details, I realized the structure bore the marks of time, but also something darker. The dark stone was stained, accentuated by rainwater, and the crucifix, corroded by rust, leaned slightly, as if it had yielded to the weight of what it held. The inscriptions, now nearly faded, barely revealed the priest's name, but symbols engraved in bas-relief could be seen, mingled with irregular scratches, as if someone had desperately tried to scratch the surface. Touching the cold stone, I felt a chill that wasn't just physical, but seemed to come from within, as if my very soul had recoiled in warning. The sound echoing from within no longer resembled mere prayers, but frantic pleas, mixing snatches of Latin with muffled screams that made my heart race uncontrollably. It was as if the priest's voice had lost its once sacred cadence and was now in a full-throated struggle, crying out against something that remained trapped with him. Beneath the earth, with each passing second the intensity grew, and I didn't know if I remained standing out of courage or inability to move. What kept me there, before that forgotten tomb, was the certainty that the climax had not yet arrived, and that I was about to witness a revelation that would challenge not only my sanity, but also all my convictions about life, faith, and death itself. As I drew closer, I knelt before the storm-soaked grave, feeling the cold of the stone seep through my clothes and freeze my skin, as if the tomb itself rejected my presence. It was then that, amid the drawn-out moans, I could clearly hear the words emerging from beneath. They weren't just indistinct sounds, but entire passages of prayers, spoken in a Latin thick with pain. "Free me, Lord." The plea echoed through the rain, repeated almost obsessively, as if someone were still struggling to expel something that insisted on remaining. My heart was beating so hard in my chest that it seemed to keep pace with the words, and for a moment I felt like I was participating in that ritual interrupted over a century ago. With each repetition, the voice grew more anguished, as if losing the strength of faith and being replaced by pure despair. What had once sounded like prayer began to transform into long, desperate screams, so intense I could have sworn the ground vibrated beneath my knees. The once cadenced phrases dissolved into wails that tore through the night, mingling with the thunder. Like a chorus of agony that came not from just one man, but from something greater, something that seemed to multiply within the earth. In that instant, the feeling that I was not alone became unbearable, and the air around me seemed to weigh down, as if the very atmosphere were being compressed by the forces at work within. The rain was falling violently, but I could no longer hear it clearly, as the screams drowned out every other sound. It was as if the priest, in his final agony, had been swallowed by something that remained active, an entity that transformed his sacred words into a macabre parody, a testament to eternal defeat. My entire body trembled, and the light from the flashlight wavered as if it would give way, leaving me at the mercy of total darkness. I tried to retreat, but I couldn't. It was as if my feet were glued to the ground, forcing me to hear every detail of that indescribable clamor. It was at that moment that I understood the true horror. It wasn't just hearing a voice lost in time, but witnessing a conflict that never ended, a frozen spiritual battle between heaven and hell, echoing night after night whenever the storm brought the priest's screams back to the world. And as I realized this, I knew the worst was yet to come, for something told me that the silence that preceded the end would be even more terrifying than the screams that filled the present. Suddenly, everything ceased. The voice pleading for deliverance was swallowed by a silence, so dense that the sound of the rain became deafening again, as if I had been wrenched from a trance and brutally returned to reality. I remained motionless before the grave, my breath ragged and my heart hammering against my chest, trying to understand if I had truly witnessed something supernatural or if my mind, influenced by the stories surrounding that priest, had created a delirium capable of shaking me so. However, no matter how much I searched for a logical explanation, something inside me insisted that this was not imagination, but the eternal repetition of an agony that never found rest. I struggled to my feet, avoiding another glance at the sodden stone that held that secret, and walked unsteadily away from the spot, feeling as if the darkness were about to pull me back at any moment. I never returned to that section of the cemetery, and to this day I carry the memory of the screams that echoed within me long after the night had ended. Perhaps in future storms, others will hear them too, and perhaps they will understand, as I did, that there are deaths that do not end battles, but only perpetuate them. If this story disturbed you, wait until you hear the next story of a gravedigger who dared to listen to what should never have been heard. That night, the cemetery seemed more alive than ever, even though all the bodies that rested there were buried beneath layers of cold, silent earth. The wind blew among the tombstones like a forgotten lament, and the moon, hidden behind heavy clouds, cast only fragments of pale light on the rusted crosses. I walked slowly among the graves, holding the lantern that swayed with each gust, when an unexpected sound shattered the ritualistic silence of the place. It wasn't the creaking of wind-whipped trees, nor the rustling of rats venturing between the mausoleums, but something that seemed human, something rising from the earth itself. At first, I believed it was just an illusion, for who in their right mind would accept the idea of hearing a female voice emerging from a coffin sealed for over a century? However, with each step, the whispers became clearer, more charged with a pain that pierced the night and clung to my mind as if impossible to ignore. The sensation was that someone was calling for help, that fragile words were escaping through handfuls of compressed earth, crying out to be heard, as if death had not been enough to silence the agony. The sound was soft and yet piercing, carrying within it a plea beyond logical explanation. It was as if the murmurs carried the memory of a forgotten tragedy, buried not only in the ground, but also in the city's memory. I remained motionless for a few moments, trying to decide whether to advance toward the source of the lament, or whether it would be better to retreat and abandon that shadowy area before something worse happened. However, curiosity, that irresistible poison, drove me forward, and deep within me, I already knew I was about to discover a secret that should not be revealed. If you enjoy dark stories like this, subscribe to the channel and leave a like to support future stories. Long before I worked in that cemetery, the oldest residents had told a story that always seemed more legend than fact to me, until the night I first heard those whispers. They said that in the late 19th century, in a small American community, a wedding that was supposed to mark the beginning of a happy life turned into a tragedy that would never be forgotten. The young bride, dressed in white and surrounded by family and friends, had fainted at the altar amid tears of joy and the astonishment of her guests. Despair was immediate. Local doctors were rushed to the scene, but the limited science of the time diagnosed what seemed obvious. Her heart had stopped, and nothing could be done. The news spread quickly, and within hours, what was supposed to be a celebratory banquet turned into an impromptu wake. The young woman's body was hastily prepared, still in her wedding dress, the veil covering her face and the ring still attached to her delicate finger. The rush to bury her was motivated not only by the family's grief, but also by the fear that an unknown illness was behind her sudden death. The coffin was closed and taken to the cemetery, where, amid tears and prayers, it descended into the earth, as if it were the final chapter of a story cut short too soon. However, rumors began to surface days after the burial. Neighbors near the cemetery claimed to have heard muffled screams during the night, pleas that seemed to come from underground, accompanied by dull knocks against the wood. Many said the young woman was not dead when she was buried, but in a deep coma, unable to react until it was too late. This version was never confirmed, but it was enough to fuel a collective fear that spanned generations. And on that silent night, when I listened to the murmurs, I realized that perhaps the echoes of this tragedy were not just in the past, but still wandering, begging to be heard. As I pondered the legend that haunted that forgotten section of the cemetery, I realized the sound was resurfacing, this time with a disturbing clarity that left no doubt as to its origin. It wasn't the distant echoes of wind passing through cracks in the stones, nor the croaking of nocturnal animals that had so often played tricks on me. This was different. It was human, feminine, filled with desperation. The words reached me fragmented, yet recognizable, as if someone were pleading for help amidst the suffocating earth. For a moment I tried to convince myself that I was tired, that my weary mind was projecting sounds from the story I already knew, but the intensity and clarity of those pleas left me no choice. The phrases repeated themselves in an almost pleading tone, mixing moans and ragged breaths, as if each word were being wrung from someone struggling to survive. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and I realized I was frozen in place. unable to decide whether to run away or move forward to see exactly where the cries were coming from. Fear told me it was folly to stay, but curiosity pushed me forward, reminding me that perhaps I was standing before living proof that those ancient stories were never just fabrications. My entire body seemed to react contradictorily. As my hands trembled as I held the flashlight, my feet took cautious steps toward the source of the sound. Each time I got closer, the words became clearer, and I no longer had any doubt that it was a woman's voice. It was soft, but imbued with desperation, as if it carried the pain of someone ripped from life prematurely, someone who had not yet accepted the silence imposed by death. A feeling of claustrophobia began to overwhelm me, as if I myself were trapped underground, trying to scream for help without anyone hearing. And it was in that moment, when I finally understood that there was no turning back, that I realized something even more terrifying. The voice didn't seem to be just asking for help, but rather guiding me, drawing me closer, as if it wanted me to witness what remained buried, waiting to be revealed. With each step, I took closer to that forgotten section of the cemetery. The air seemed to grow heavier, as if the surrounding atmosphere had acquired a suffocating density that made it difficult even to breathe. The rain had momentarily ceased, but the cold wind blew through the space between the tombstones, carrying with it a silence so oppressive that each crack of the wood of my lantern sounded like thunder. With each passing moment, I had the impression I wasn't walking alone, as if invisible shadows were moving around me, watching my approach with silent, cruel anticipation. It was impossible to ignore that the female voice, pleading and trembling, became increasingly clear, unmistakably indicating the exact location from which it originated. It was then that my flashlight illuminated the ancient tombstone, covered in moss and marked by deep cracks that bore witness to the weight of decades of neglect. The worn marble bore nearly illegible inscriptions, but a woman's name, partially erased by time, could still be made out, and the date of death coincided with the time when the legend of the bride buried alive had spread throughout the city. Dried flowers lay at the foot of the grave, turned to dust by time, and the iron crucifix, rusted and crooked, seemed to lean as if unable to support the weight of the secret it held. As I touched the cold stone with my fingertips, a shiver ran through me, not as a physical reflex, but as a rejection of my own soul, which seemed to beg me to turn away. But what held me still was what I heard. Next, the voice, previously muffled and distant, now echoed almost from the surface of the earth, as if the barrier separating the dead from the living had grown too thin. Each word seemed to vibrate in my chest, filling the air with a palpable sense of despair, and I realized it wasn't just a lament, but a call to myself. In that instant, I understood there was no retreat, for something deep within me knew the sounds were about to transform into something even more terrifying, something that would reveal once and for all the stifled pain of that bride. It was as I leaned closer to the grave that I realized how much the sound had changed. What had previously seemed like a fragile murmur had become heartbreaking pleas, muffled by the earth but intense enough to pierce every layer of silence that covered the cemetery. The female voice no longer simply asked for help, but cried out like someone struggling on the edge between life and death, as if no time had passed, and she was still trapped inside that coffin, unable to be heard by those who could save her. I felt my entire body shudder as the words grew more desperate, and for a moment I closed my eyes in a futile attempt to block out what was somehow penetrating my mind and settling there like an invisible scar. It was then that the sound changed again, and what followed was etched in my memory as one of the most terrifying moments I've ever experienced. Between the muffled screams, insistent scratching began to echo at first faint and spaced, but soon becoming frantic and disordered. as if frail, desperate nails were ripping the wood from the inside out, fighting the crushing claustrophobia of death. The noise was unmistakable, a harsh scratching that accompanied the moans, creating a macabre symphony that seemed to come not only from beneath the earth, but also from the invisible walls of my mind. With every second, the bride's despair seemed to grow, as if the awareness of her eternal prison were renewed in my presence. I could almost feel the vibration of the scratches piercing the sodden earth, as if the coffin were about to open, not by physical force, but by the sheer determination of the spirit that remained imprisoned there. The flashlight in my hand wavered, and the unstable beam of light intermittently illuminated the tombstone, as if trying to simultaneously show me and hide the exact location from which that agony originated. Panic gripped me completely, and yet I couldn't back away. It was as if I were hypnotized by that sound, unable to turn away from something that demanded to be witnessed. With each new scratch, with each muffled scream, the conviction that the legend was real became indisputable. And in that instant, I understood that the story of that bride hadn't ended on the day of her burial, but remained alive, screaming through the centuries, waiting for someone brave enough or insane enough to hear it through. And then, as abruptly as it had begun, everything ceased. The scratching sound vanished as if it had never been, and the voice that had once pleaded so intensely was swallowed by a sepulchral silence, heavy and absolute, leaving me alone before that time-worn tombstone. The wind began to blow through the trees again, bringing back a sense of normalcy, but deep inside I knew nothing was normal, for the memory of what I had heard would be forever etched in my mind, like a wound that never heals. I struggled to my feet, feeling my legs tremble, and backed away slowly, not daring to immediately turn my back on the bride's grave. My heart still pounded wildly, as if each beat were a repetition of the agony I had witnessed. I walked away until the sound of the wind drowned out the echoes my mind insisted on repeating. But even after leaving that section of the cemetery, I couldn't escape the feeling that the voice still accompanied me, murmuring softly in the back of my mind. They say that on cold, silent nights, the oldest gravediggers still hear the bride begging to be freed, and after that night I have no doubt that her tragedy never found rest. If that story made the silence seem more frightening, wait until you hear the next account from a gravedigger who witnessed something even more disturbing. That night, the cemetery seemed to hold a secret even deeper than the bodies resting beneath the cold earth. The wind cut through the space between the graves with a mournful whistle, and the lanterns we carried trembled in our hands, as if the darkness itself wished to swallow any light that dared to penetrate that forgotten area. I walked beside two colleagues, each in silence, and as accustomed as we were to the nightly routine of watching and maintaining the graves, there was something different about that early morning, a sense of heaviness in the air that seemed to watch us, waiting for a specific moment to reveal itself. As we crossed the old iron fence that delimited the isolated area, a cold gust hit us as if we had entered a forbidden space. There, among rusted crosses and warning signs corroded by time, we began to hear the first sounds. At first, we thought it was the wind passing through the cracks in the stones, creating auditory illusions, but soon we realized they were not just scattered noises. It was a song, a continuous lament that seemed to rise from the ground, as if dozens of still living voices were trapped underground. With each step, the sound became clearer, and we could distinguish not only melody, but also muffled words, interspersed with cries for help that echoed in unison. My heart was pounding wildly in my chest, and even as I tried to rationalize what I was hearing, I knew there was no logical explanation for the experience. We were facing something beyond comprehension, something that should never be heard by the living. And it was in that moment, as the silence of the cemetery mingled with the chorus of the dead, that I realized the answer to what we were witnessing could only be found by revisiting the dark past of that area, where stories of plague and mass burials still remained buried with their secrets. If you enjoy dark stories like this, subscribe to the channel and leave a like to support future stories. The area we were in was no ordinary section of the cemetery, and this was noticeable even to those who had never heard the local stories. Those graves bore distinctive markings, as if time itself had transformed them into silent warnings. These weren't just old graves. They were tombs sealed with iron and concrete, a barrier erected more to contain than to protect. The explanation, according to records still preserved in the city archives, dates back to the 19th century, when a wave of plague struck small American communities, spreading fear and panic among entire families. Amid the rush to contain the spread of the disease, bodies were buried by the dozens, many of them in questionable condition, as doctors at the time were barely able to differentiate life from death in cases of deep coma or paralyzing fever. It was said that mass burials were carried out hastily, and to prevent the earth from being disturbed or the bodies exhumed by animals, authorities decided to seal the coffins in fortified tombs. For many, it was a precautionary health measure. For others, a tragic error that condemned people still alive to die suffocated under tons of stone and earth. The community, tormented by the weight of suspicion, began to avoid that area, and over the generations, it was simply isolated, becoming a zone forbidden to visitors and often even to the gravediggers themselves. Yet the stories never completely disappeared. Some swear they heard muffled screams in the nights following the burials, and others claim to have heard banging coming from the ground during the quietest hours. These rumors fueled the belief that the plague victims never found rest and that their voices still echo, trapped in an eternal chorus of agony. As I recalled these stories, I realized that what we were hearing that night was not just a coincidence, but perhaps an exact repetition of the torment they carried into the earth. And it was at that moment that I understood that the sounds would still intensify, revealing that the silence would never be complete in that place. As we stood motionless before that forgotten area, the sounds that had previously seemed distant began to gain a disturbing clarity, as if each syllable were piercing the earth and finding a direct path to our ears. They weren't just random murmurs, but fragmented phrases, interspersed with moans that lingered in an almost ritualistic cadence. The most frightening thing was that these voices didn't disperse, didn't blur together, but seemed to organize themselves into a mournful pattern, like a chant repeating itself in unison, laden with suffering and a spiritual weight impossible to ignore. One of my colleagues tried to laugh off his nervousness, suggesting that perhaps it was just the wind pushing air through the cracks in the rocks, creating an echo that tricked our senses. But when we all held our breath to listen more closely, it became clear there was no mistaking it. What echoed from beneath the earth was no figment of our imagination. They were human voices, pleading in an indistinct language, sometimes in recognizable words, sometimes in guttural sounds that sounded more like cries than articulate sentences. And the longer we spent there, the more the feeling that we were surrounded by a collective presence overcame us. The flashlight in my hand began to tremble, not from a battery failure, but from the intensity with which my hand was shaking. Each time the beam passed through the rusty chains that sealed the tombs, the voices seemed to grow louder, as if reacting to our presence. A strange chill ran down my spine, and I felt as if the ground beneath my feet was pulsing almost imperceptibly, as if something were stirring deep within. Rationality tried to keep me calm, telling me it was impossible for voices to penetrate layers of wood, stone, and earth after so many years. But inside me, there was no longer room for logic, only for growing dread. And it was in that instant when I realized we were all hearing the same thing, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that I understood the call could not be ignored. Those voices weren't just asking to be heard. They were demanding we draw closer, as if the true revelation still awaited us, hidden behind the chains and the sealed stone that separated the living from the dead. We decided to press on, even though every instinct screamed for retreat. The sounds came from so close it was impossible to resist, and the feeling that something was calling us from within those sealed tombs was stronger than the fear that gripped us. Our flashlights illuminated the moss-covered headstones, where the inscriptions were barely legible, and the rusty chains, held together by worn padlocks, betrayed the forced isolation of the area. As we walked, I noticed that the ground seemed to vibrate slightly, as if the subterranean wailing created waves that traveled through the earth and rose to our feet, making it clear that we were standing on something still breathing. As we approached the first tomb, the air grew denser, almost unbreathable, as if the atmosphere were permeated by a metallic smell of rust, mixed with the odor of damp earth. The sound of the mournful chants intensified, no longer muffled, but resonating so that it seemed to envelop the entire room. It was as if the voices filled the space between us, swirling around us in a harrowing chorus that increased in volume and rhythm as we advanced. I felt my legs tremble, not from the cold of the night, but from the clear realization that we were facing something that could not be explained even by the oldest stories. One of my colleagues knelt down, trying to listen more closely, and at that moment I realized that the voices weren't just scattered sounds. They were organized as if there was an intention behind them, a shared rhythm that united all the laments into a single funereal melody. This wasn't the isolated groan of an imprisoned dead person, but a collection of voices that seemed to recognize each other, as if they still maintained a collective consciousness even after centuries of burial. The idea that dozens of people could still speak in unison beneath that earth made me feel that we were not just facing a legend, but a secret that should never have been witnessed. And it was at that moment, when the sound became almost unbearable and each of us felt our hearts ready to leap from our chests, that I understood that what we had been hearing until then was only the prelude, and that the true horror was yet to come, waiting to manifest itself before us in an undeniable way. We were so close to the sealed tombs that the sound no longer seemed to come from beneath the earth, but from all directions at once, as if the air had become a channel for the lamentations. Suddenly, the isolated murmurs gave way to a unison, mournful and rhythmic chant, making the earth vibrate in a macabre rhythm. It was as if dozens of voices, trapped in sealed coffins and graves, had found a way to coordinate, forming a chorus of agony that no human ear should ever hear. The rhythm was reminiscent of funeral hymns, but distorted by a pain that permeated time and flesh, as if each note were the memory of a life cut short before its end. With each passing second, the voices grew louder until there was no doubt they were calling us. Amidst the chants, clear pleas emerged, words repeated in chorus, "Open up, let us out." The repetition of these phrases, filled with desperation, caused a suffocating sensation, as if the invisible pressure of those voices pressed against our bodies, forcing us to feel the weight of their imprisonment. I looked at my colleagues and saw the same terror etched on each of their faces, wide eyes and shallow breaths, as if we were about to succumb to madness. At that moment, I felt as if the earth beneath our feet pulsed in sync with the chants, as if hundreds of invisible hands were simultaneously pounding against the wooden and stone walls, desperately trying to break through the barrier that held them captive. The sound of their moans and chants mingled with the creaking of the earth, creating an unbearable symphony of collective despair. They were no longer just voices trying to communicate, but an army of the dead demanding to be freed. The flashlight in my hand suddenly went out, plunging us into near-total darkness, illuminated only by the faint moonlight that pierced the clouds. And in that, suffocating gloom, the impression that we were surrounded by something beyond human comprehension became absolute. I could sense that if we remained there for a second longer, we would not be mere witnesses, but participants in a tragedy that transcended the line between the living and the dead. It was in that instant that I realized that at any moment the silence would return, but what came with it might be even more terrifying than all the choir we had heard so far. As the chorus of voices reached its peak, absolute silence descended so suddenly that my ears rang, as if trying to fill the void left by the absence of that oppressive sound. The darkness seemed even heavier without the accompaniment of the laments, and for a few seconds we remained still, unable to breathe deeply, fearing that any noise we made might reawaken that which had fallen silent. The wind blew through the chains again, and the metallic creaking echoed somberly, as if a farewell or perhaps a warning never to return to that forgotten area. As we walked away, each step felt fraught with a new, uncomfortable awareness. We weren't alone that night, and we would likely never again be at peace remembering what we'd witnessed. The sealed tomb sector wasn't just a place of ancient stories, but a repository of stifled voices still crying out for the life that had been ripped from them. To this day, when I close my eyes, I feel those voices continue to resonate somewhere beyond the earth, waiting for the right moment to be heard again. If you want to hear more stories like this and delve even deeper into real-life horror stories experienced by Gravediggers, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the next episodes.